I'm David Dunlop, a landscape painter in Venice. I'm certainly not the first landscape painter. This canal, the Rio dei Mendicanti, painted by so many artists. For centuries, popes, kings, noblemen, artists, poets, writers, tourists, they all came here to the Campo, San Giovanni, and San Paolo. This place particularly attracts artists from all over the world. Titian came here from a mountain village. Canaletto and Francesco Guardi, they were born here. Americans came. Artists from France, Singer Sargent, who was a prodigy at the age of 24, a success in Paris as a young artist and a student. He studied with Carolus Duran, friend of Monet. He shows up to measure his skills against all of the greats who painted here. Would rediscover the value of landscapes, discover the joy of landscape painting here in this Campo. Francesco Guardi painted in this courtyard. A century later, Richard Parks Bonington paints that equestrian statue. This Campo is legendary. This canal is famous for attracting artists. So it was the perfect place for Sargent to test himself. How was Sargent going to make a difference as an artist in Venice? He had some new tools. One of those was the camera. A new way of cropping, a new way of thinking, having studied with Carolus Duran in Paris and at the L'École des Beaux-Arts. Having a new understanding of color theory, theories of the Impressionists. We'll try to explore how Singer Sargent changes art and becomes a megastar in the art world, where museums from across the globe will want to collect his work. The Brooklyn Museum, the Metropolitan Museum, museums in Scotland and London, the Boston Museum. But it all starts here, in this Campo, along this Rio. Later we'll go to a balcony where Singer Sargent tries his work in oil and tries out the new theories in painting in oil. Au premier coup, the first time, the single glance. It all begins here in this Campo in Venice. Singer Sargent came into and left this world as a traveler. He planned his last trip in 1825 to oversee the Boston mural installation. That was a transatlantic voyage he would not make. His first trip, an accident of birth, because his parents just lost their first child and escaped their sadness with travel to Europe. And so in 1856, Mary Sargent gave birth to John in Florence. Their life was nomadic, through the cultural capitals of Europe, sustained by Mary's small annuity. His homeschooled curriculum was languages, art, and music, led by his father, a doctor who no longer practiced. John's gifts for music and art were celebrated and indulged. His best friends were his sketchbooks and his sisters, Violet and Emily. The tiny Sargent caravan found its way back to Rome as John turned 12. And Rome, as with so many great artists, offered John his first formal art education. He'd returned to Florence to study in the academy. The road, 6 years later, led John and his obliging family to Paris for his study at the L'École des Beaux-Arts and the studio of Carolus Duran. Duran would make a modern artist out of John. 5 years with the famous Duran, and John was ready for the stage of international art. Duran gave John the tools. Au premier coup, do it at once. Watch your values. Freedom and economy in your strokes. Generosity with your spirit and materials. Simplify. This was painting like Frans Hals and Velázquez. Later, Fairfield Porter summed it up. Keep the essential, eliminate the important. Portraits were John's road to fame and fortune. They were also his frustration and moment of infamy, which came early, age 27, in Paris, with his portrait of Madame X, or Madame Gautreau. He called the portrait Madame X after the French press excoriated him for the portrait's sexual provocation, its daring insouciance, its radical new look. John kept the portrait to sell it years later to New York's Met. Paris was no longer hospitable. But Sargent had options and friends, lots of well-placed friends, from Oscar Wilde, Robert Louis Stevenson, Henry James, to Edward Manet and Claude Monet. Henry James put out the welcome mat in London, and London became home at Tite Street, and the Tite Street studio. But home was also the road with his friends and sisters. America was on the itinerary by age 20 because, as an expat, he needed a passport. And there were family, friends, and business in Boston and New York. By 1890, with a mural commission in the Boston Public Library. Murals were big, prestigious projects in the 19th century. They made your reputation, as they had for artists for centuries. There's Tiepolo, Tintoretto, and Titian. Sargent had already painted the massive El Jalal for Isabella Stewart Gardner, Boston's prestige client. By 1900, John was sick of portraits, and he said so. No more aristocrats with something wrong with the smile. He was through with the flattery and obliging the demands of others on his canvases. He turned to landscapes, to cities like Venice. And he turned to watercolors. Rapture at last. Their spontaneous bursts of color, the unlabored release of personal passion, expressions of sunlight, moments of pleasure. He loved the travel. He loved the company. He loved the paintings. And that was his new problem. He didn't want to sell them. Without income from portraits, he needed to sell watercolors. His answer? Sell them in thematic blocks, 40 or 80 at a time, to museums. From the Brooklyn Museum to Boston to New York's Met, they eagerly obliged. Sargent found adventure in art on the road to Spain, to Capri, to the Alps, and to here in Venice. Here in the Carozonico, where Sargent found a studio, and he found other artists and subjects just as Whistler had done the year before. Or here in Venice, at his cousin's Palazzo Barbaro, where literary and influential friendships were born, where you could meet Edith Wharton and Robert Browning. Or here, on these canals, with his sketchbooks and his camera, Sargent found inspiration in sunlight and shadows. His camera gave him new ways of seeing, of cropping designs, of cropping Venice, her churches and gondolas, to frame the moving moment as the gondolas slide by. Like Richard Parks Bonington, like Canaletto, like Guardi, he sat in this piazza, like we're sitting here now, under a canopy of umbrellas, protected from the sun, as they would prefer to be too, enjoying, like everyone else, a cappuccino and a dolce. Tourists and artists today come to photograph and record the experience. The Pope himself has been here centuries ago to dedicate this church, this bridge, this area. James Abbott McNeill Whistler comes through this Campo, has seen that other people have painted it and decided, everybody else has done it, I'm doing something different. So he crosses over that bridge and goes to the next canal. But John Singer Sargent is going to look with new eyes. He arrives here first as a child, then as an adult, a young artist in 1880, overlapping with Whistler for a brief period, and will continue to come here, to this Campo, to that canal, up until the First World War. He paints a variety of watercolors, here are two of them, on the canal. And across the canal, I can still see this window. These doors are right over there behind a group of people right now. He's doing his painting in a gondola. He's got a board on his lap, like this. Oops, there goes the water. I'll bet you the water spilled in his lap too. So he sets the board on his lap and he does some quick pencil sketches. He'll also do quick sketches in watercolor. Some more developed, some less. So this is the church. Here it is again. Right here he's down low on the water inside of the gondola. Do you see how the gondola is cropped? We don't see most of it. The picture is cropped off, is cut off, just as part of this church is cut off, just as the end of this bridge is cut off. That kind of cropping is a consequence of using the camera. He's not alone in that, but it's affected his vision in the sense that he's found a new way to compose,
a way that is contemporary with the new century. From here, you can see the palette is bright, is strong. The darks are rich, and the colors are complementary. We have blue, and we have these golden colors, these yellows, and they're really new to the time. They're new to this period. Between 1880 and the First World War, the development of almost all of the contemporary colors would come to pass, the cadmium yellows. He could continue to use ultramarine blue, cobalt blue, synthetic versions, which were all available in the 19th century. He has the advantage of watercolor in tubes, and that's an interesting thing we also know about him, is that he prefers to use his watercolors in tubes. There were many people selling pans of watercolor, but the records show he used tubes and flat brushes, occasional round brush, and his fingers. These are quick strokes. This is casual and relaxed painting. It's not something that's overlabored, and he's not interested in all of the particular ornaments. He's not an architectural, detailed painter. I'm going to try to keep that in mind as I look at this scene through Sargent's eyes. Artists have known throughout history, since the time of Cennino Cennini, in his Libro dell'Arte of 1396, don't use that lead paint and put the brush in your mouth. Careful with the orpiment, because it's made with arsenic. Artists in Sargent's time didn't know that cadmium was as deadly as it was. So the cadmium yellow and the cadmium red later, or the cadmium oranges, which he would like, were deadly, and he wouldn't have used the rubber gloves that I'm going to use right now, because it doesn't matter whether you're using watercolor or oil or pastel, those heavy metals are still there. Sargent has a variety of approaches to doing watercolor, but let's talk about his composition. Remember, he's used to cropping buildings, not showing the entire part of a building. So he wouldn't show the entire 1, 2, 3 wall church. He'd crop some section. He does that even with buildings like Santa Maria della Salute across town. And I'm going to do the same as Sargent, because I'm supposed to be looking through Sargent's eyes. So if I start with the church here and let it compose and frame this part of the picture, you'll notice it's about a third where I've let it set up. I'm going to just put a line right here to remind myself that's where it is. Now any pencil graphite underneath is going to be very casual and very minimal. A reminder of where the bridge may be. And when he hits it with the paint, he's not going to be particularly concerned that the color stays within the lines. Because interestingly enough, biologically, neurobiologically, color doesn't stay in lines. It floats in and out of them. And that would be something that artists of the 20th century, like Matisse, would begin to exploit, that we place color inside of edges. Sargent and Turner and Whistler were a few of the artists to first experiment with that effect. So he's still using the tradition of linear perspective, as well as compositional forms that have been employed for hundreds of years. Poussin, Claude, Turner. For example, the frame of the object on the right and another one on the left. And slowly we have a vortex that moves into deepest space over there. We go through and under a bridge into this space. This form and this form help through the principle of overlapping or occlusion to give us a sense of space. This will be lighter, this will be darker. The buildings themselves will have light faces and dark faces, which will give a sense of volume. All of this has to be done in a relaxed method, unhurried. He wasn't hurried. He's floating softly in a gondola right in that canal. Bonington sitting right here peacefully with a cappuccino. No pressure. I'll do one, maybe I'll do another, maybe I'll do another. And when I go home in the evening, I will have 4 or 5 watercolors, 2 or 3 at least. So we have a line set up for a vanishing point on a sight line that is my eye level. Like Canaletto, like Francesco Guardi, We know where that eye level is located, and it's right along in here. That's my eye level right now. Not at the top of the bridge, just about where the steps break, lower part of the door. And that means that if I'm using a vanishing point, and I don't need to draw it in, this was all part of an automatic vocabulary that somebody very familiar, very conversant with the principles of linear perspective would do. The diagonal recessionals to all of the parallel buildings going back would aim here. Window lines all aim there. Everything aims there. Another point is over here with a vanishing point on the same eye level because it's 2-point perspective. And Sargent was accomplished in 2- and 3-point multi-point perspective. With just a few cursory marks suggesting places. And the light in his skies is often uncluttered with clouds. This isn't the sort of thing that Turner would do. It's the sort of thing Sargent would do. He's going to use this just for luminosity with a simple wash. The darks in here, and I'll scrub out some lights. This will be quite bright here. We want light in these two locations with a dark band in between. Light to here, dark to here. So I've got a light letter L. That's the plan. And that's in keeping with Sargent's approach. Let's put in some color. We know, because of his study with complementary color, that he likes violets, blues, and especially popular among the Impressionists was the yellow and violet color complement. They're opposites, yellow and violet. Here is an opaque, light blue-green. Here is carmine, purple, a darker violet, white, ultramarine blue, two different manufacturers' ideas of a yellow, a gamboge yellow. And you can see how rich the color is when we're working from a tube. It's nice and strong. And because he's going to scrub out, and these colors are transparent and non-staining, I can get back to the white. That was important to John Singer Sargent. It meant that he didn't have to really get anxious about preserving all of his whites. Now, if I want to warm that color a little bit, I would warm it with an iron oxide. I'm going to put one of those colors up right now. Something else he would have used to catch the feeling of rust on the boats, deep browns, and that's a burnt sienna or an iron oxide. And here we are. And if I add a little bit of that, to that color, I start to warm it up. And then I can still come back and remove it and get back to white, because all of them are transparents and not particularly strong stainers. You may wonder how many watercolors John Singer Sargent is going to paint since 1900 until his death. 700. And 150 oils, almost all of them landscapes. He probably paints 150 watercolors alone here in Venice. Sargent arrives here in Venice just as Whistler is leaving. They overlap. New ideas are in the air for both artists. Other painters, like Whistler and a photographer, Carlo Naya, were looking at Venice differently. They had not come to reproduce the standard views, the monuments, Canaletto's Cannon, St. Mark's Square. They were here to discover and define a new aspect of Venice, to show something else. It's easy to block in from to light to dark if you've kept your design simple. And like Sargent, I could play with the wet paint on the wet surface. Making the paint thinner with water. I'm just lifting some of the paint out, scrubbing it back down as he would do to find stains and light. So I put on more paint than I needed because I knew I would be taking it off. And if I want something darker, thinking about the violet and yellow relationship, I'll go in here to a violet because it's so complementary to the yellow. If I add the violet to the yellow, it goes brown and gets neutralized. If I add a blue to that yellow, I would make a green. And when he wants a nice deep green, that's exactly what he'll do. In simple, quick touches. And if he wants to deepen it, he can go to the carmine or his burnt sienna, we know he used it, and deepen it here. And if he wants to neutralize that, he can neutralize it with the ultramarine blue to get something deep. And with a lot of little marks, we'll suggest some material or some buildings behind. Again, relying on that violet to give him some punch against a yellow. The darker this is, the brighter this is. Because a dark area against a light area, the light area is lighter against the dark right along that edge. we can mix together a couple of these colors to get a blue-violet. And to increase the shade on this wall or part of that roof, do the same thing. Testing first. And then waiting to glaze again when the color is dry, making interesting blends because you can glaze the watercolor and put another color on top, as he discovered, if you've let the previous layer dry. As soon as that's dry, I can glaze it again and get these interesting color mixes, those that appealed to him. So going over it again helps deepen those colors. Now he likes the complements of the blues and the greens against the yellows. So, like Sargent, I'm going to put some of those other blues and violets into his shadows in here. As he applies the colors, whether he's making them deeper or lighter, he's thinking about the relationships of not just light and dark, but the color theory, especially the one he understands. Everyone owns the book who's an artist. Winslow Homer owns the book, Renoir owns the book. It's Michel Chevreul's book on the principles of color and harmony and contrast. And there is a wonderful description of simultaneous and successive contrast. That is, how a violet, when next to a yellow, changes the intensity of the yellow and the intensity of the violet, just as a light next to a dark changes the intensity of the light and the dark right where they abut. That simultaneous contrast effect is driving so much painting, including the painting of the Impressionists themselves. All his friends. He's a close friend of Claude Monet. He helps him find dealers, he helps him make sales, they travel together to London, he stays with him at Giverny. So John Singer Sargent is a fluent speaker in many languages. French is as easy to him as English. He's also a great singer and musician. His skills will carry him into all sorts of circles. In this case, his looseness, well, in perspective there is accuracy. In handling, it feels free because he's not trying to contain himself to specific architectural information. I've cropped this building just as he would have camera cropped the same building. He did, in fact. He did crop that building as he cropped this one over here. Want something deep and dark? Go to ultramarine blue. The dark will always contract and recede and push the territory deeper in, so that pushes that door in. It's just as easy to come back with the rag and lift any part of it out. Those violet shadows, observed by Eugène Delacroix on his trips to Tangiers and Morocco. Delacroix notices in the bright, scorching sunlight that the shadows are not gray, that the yellow-white light there has shadows that are violet. And then, as Monet notices in the snow on a sunny day, up where he lives in the north of France, that the shadows on the snow are not gray, they are blue-violet because of the yellow-white sunlight. And all of a sudden, we start seeing this kind of violet and blue-green in shadows everywhere, from Sargent to Monet. A century ago, the Brooklyn Museum, the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, and the Metropolitan Museum had bought out successive exhibitions of his watercolors. This occurs on the eve of America's first big modernist exhibition, the Armory Show of 1913. That's where Marcel Duchamp and Picasso and Braque were all introduced to America, and a group of abstract American painters. They separate themselves from the generation that was John Singer Sargent. Suddenly, he appears a bit old-fashioned. But time brings us transcendence and a new perspective. Today, we marvel at his freedom of gesture, the brilliance of contrast in his color, and his tender affections for fountains and figures and forests. Just the simple elegance of his craft designs as they draw from those rich troves of art history that he was so familiar with. And as shadows crawl across the Campo here, they can take on their violet aspect. We can remove the paint pretty easily too. Just as I showed you in the beginning, he could remove the paint if it was transparent and non-staining. He can at any stage come back in and decide to lift paint off. We'll let water do interesting things all by itself.
If you asked Sargent for advice as a young artist, this is what he'd give you. Begin with a solid and simple design. Sketch frequently. Observe scrupulously. Keep the necessary. Dispense with the rest. Simplify. If it's not working, scrap it. Start again, especially with portraits.
Here's another example of glazing. It's very wet, and you see it running off. The thinner you make it, the wetter it'll be, and the more it wants to run. But if this is dry, I can put a glaze on it that will change its effect, change its color. I'll just let you see so that you can see what that yellow will do here. How that changes the effect of the colors, and they're still there. They're just changing because of their relationship to the glaze and what the glaze will do to the picture. Makes an interesting mottled effect back in here. Let it dry before you put another glaze on. It's not much of a problem here in Venice because the heat in the summer will dry things pretty quickly. To hold on to this edge over here, I'll go a little deeper still. One of the wonderful things about John Singer Sargent, like Turner, was his courage with color, his willing to use what we would consider today, and what Van Gogh in 10 years, in 1880 by 1889, is going to use a principle which we'll call expressive color. Sargent will continue to play with the experience through much of his life with watercolors, and that is to artificially inflate the value of the color, pump it up, just for theatrical effect. because that pushes this color this way. While I'm letting that dry, but before I put any kind of wash in the sky, I'll poke in some darker colors. More saturated color. It gives the building just a little bit more solidity. Because of this dense, darker bit of color I'm adding right now. See how much more dense and solid the building feels with the higher contrast color placed in. I'm just going to now play with some washes, loose, carefree, and I'm going to use a cleaner cup of water for that because I don't want the pollution of that water. You know what John Singer Sargent does for water? He just simply uses the canal. Takes his cup into the canal, it's too dirty, he puts it back in the canal. We're not doing that. Sargent did that. This blue, made soft, diluted, with white added, so it turns into a pastel. As you can see, it turns into a soft pastel. Gives me another kind of shape. To help the pyramid here. Where the pastel paint doesn't touch, there are clouds. They're by default clouds. I paint just sky shape and clouds show up. I'm not trying to paint a cloud. Now, I'll make it a little deeper to the top so that we can have more recession, because as you look at the horizon, there's more glow on the horizon, it's lighter, less blue, almost pink, and as we go up, we start to pick up more blue. And you exaggerate that experience as we go up, and I'll do the same. So the blue is slowly getting a little richer as it goes up. I'm going to just soften a couple of these edges and play with the toweling so you can see what else it would do as he plays with rags to get some atmospheric effects up in here. The softer edges will give more volume to the clouds. You see how they're acquiring more volume just by playing with my fingers. Similarly, you can do the finger work with your watercolors as well, like this. If I put a color on my finger, remember Sargent, Turner, Homer, all the watercolorists were also oil painters. Richard Parks Bonington, beautiful oils, beautiful watercolors. And so they'll apply application techniques in oil to watercolor and watercolor to oil. So if I want a soft stain here with a soft yellow, or here, it's easy to do, just as easy as it is to take off. So I get a soft stain. And if I want to soften the edge of the, right in here of the shadow, I similarly can just put water on my finger and drag it out and let it blur out, out, pull away, pull the color toward here. And if the painting were flat, I could let the color just float into it. Because it's vertical, I can't do that as easily. But even so, you can see how that violet is behaving. Okay, so let's just take that off, see where we are. It's remarkable how your brain will continue to see a line when there is no line. Let's just see if I'm right about that. My director suggested that I put something in here because she was worried that I would lose the corner. I assume your brain's going to see this line is so strong, you'll continue it up, and you'll see this blue, and we'll continue it on to manufacture a corner, just like the Canisa triangle. That paint on the edges gives us an illusion that this is just paint. The window experience happens when we sharpen the edges. Now we're going across town to see where Sargent painted from a balcony, overlooking Venice, the Riva Schiavone. He paints in oil there before he paints in watercolors here. Here, high above the Riva Schiavone, the Bacino, the Empire of Venice stretching out here as it did hundreds and hundreds of years, and artists came here. They came right here. There's the Campanile, Santa Maria della Salute, San Giorgio. You have a view of it all. And artists in Venice painted the complete view of it all. Albrecht Dürer had come from the north in Germany. If you were an artist visiting in the 19th century, like John Singer Sargent, you'd want to follow in that tradition, but you'd do something different. So what was John Singer Sargent looking for? Sargent, who'd lived with a peripatetic family, living all over Europe for his childhood, came here from Paris. He was a prodigy there. He'd seen the Impressionists, was a friend of Manet, a friend of Monet. He'd been taught in the finest academy in Paris, l'École des Beaux-Arts. He was already prodigiously skilled. So he arrives here in his late 20s. For not the first time, he'd come as a child to see how he could measure up against the others, against the greats. What could he bring that was new? The new tonalist palette, the Barbizon palette. He would bring these new palettes, these new ideas, this new way of seeing, that catch it in a single glance. Not concerned with the information, but the effect of all of this light and all of this life on his canvas. He would measure himself against the greats of his time, and he would do it from right here. We're going to try to use one of his designs, one of his perspectives, right here, using his colors, his materials, and his materials were different, because by 1880, photography was everywhere. The famous photographer, Carlo Naya, had already shown how to crop and compose differently here in Venice. It was no longer the grand vistas, it was something more intimate. But Sargent starts with a vista that is more like Canaletto's and a palette more like Corot's. I'm beginning where he begins. Here are a variety of artists' points of view on the scene we're looking at now. Back in the middle of the 1700s, Canaletto was standing closer to the fondamente, closer to the pavement, when he paints this scene. Now, Sargent has seen scenes like this from other artists, and it's not just Canaletto. Lots of artists here in Venice, as well as English artists, like Turner, had come to paint this scene from here. Whistler and Sargent are going to paint the scene from a little higher up. It's a new point of view, and it's a new idea in pictures, because these two pictures tell us about two different times in history. This low horizon, below the middle of the picture, is more in keeping with the traditions of the Italians and the Dutch and the English landscape painters. This gives us a big sky and deep space because the proportion is small to large. But by 1880, artists like Sargent were aware of the new trend, the new interest in Japanese artists, of Edo Japan, the ukiyo-e, the floating world artists. And those artists had shown them a new way to design a picture. And that was to move the horizon up and to create the space just as strong by having a reciprocal, large bottom and a small top, just so long as you're not in the middle. That creates more space. The idea will be taken further and further. Monet will eventually take it to be no horizon at all the way up. And later in his career, so will John Singer Sargent. But at this point, John Singer Sargent is in his 20s. He hasn't yet painted some of the great scenes of his career. He hasn't painted Madame X, the portrait that will get him into trouble. He hasn't painted the Boston Museum pictures, which are going to give him so much fame, a 20-year project. He still has 40 years more visits to this city. Some of those times he'll bring a camera and change his point of view. And we'll see how John Singer Sargent changes over the 40 years that he continues to visit this city. But now he's young, now he's a prodigy, and he's very skilled. He's been painting his whole life. with his family, under the instruction of his mother, and the tutelage in different academies across Europe, he's learned how to paint en plein air, outdoors. And he's learned how to paint au premier coup, all at once. And he's learned how to paint from the palette of the tonalists, the Barbizons, Corot. That's the kind of palette we have here. Soon he'll be adopting the palette of the Impressionists. Let's look again this design and see what he's done. All right, so John Singer Sargent has learned how to do what they call in the mid-19th century, it's all a French vocabulary, but it's a pochade, it's a quick squeeze, it's a quick etude, it's a quick study. The horizon is up here. And the perspective, the lines of perspective are going to this sight line. Now, he's an expert of linear perspective. So we've got the lines of perspective are moving like this. And the way the picture turns, same sight line, and it turns in 3 places for him, even though we get the feeling of a slow turn. It's a long straight line, no curve. There's a curve there, there's no curve in his picture because he's using linear perspective. He takes a long turn here, and we see the buildings slowly climb down in a big triangle to this space. That's the design. Then, just so that it's a little more interesting, and in keeping with the tradition of all the landscapes he's seen, because he can't ignore them. They are a part of his vocabulary. He and scales back the activity that's going to be happening along here. And in keeping with the scale, just like Raphael's School of Athens or Botticelli, the traditions of linear perspective have told him that a figure this big here is this big here, is this big here, is this big here, is infinitely smaller here. And he groups them in clusters, little groups. They're a little bigger here and here. And you have the template for John Singer Sargent's painting. It would be easier to keep it simple, but he was trained to keep it simple, to distill, to find an essence, to look and find, as Corot said, a first impression. And as his teacher, Carolus Duran, said, don't look for the details. Don't look for anything but what you get as a single quality, a single experience, a single impression, something simple. And that's what we've got. If you'd gone to l'École des Beaux-Arts, or studied with Carolus Duran, or studied at the Florentine Academy, or any of the innumerable places that Sargent had an artistic education, you would have learned the value of contour drawing. You would have learned the value of drawing, the design. Here in Italy, it's disegno, and disegno è attimo. It's the most important thing. We've known that for centuries. And so the first thing Sargent's going to do, as he tries to employ this new Japanese aesthetic of the high horizon, is to put that horizon up here, but denote in his marks where he thinks he wants this to go. He knows his sight line's going to be along in here. And we're going to take a nice long trip down here before we start the turn. Like that. So we go from very wide to very thin, very fast. And the buildings, as you saw in the design, go down for him in this triangle. And so they continue while the vertical facades work like this. The tower is very tall and far off to this side. Then comes the tapering, and it all whittles down into a simple, skinny mass of confusion against the light. And that's what we're doing, contre-jour, against the light. It was the preferred manner of painting, not only for the veduti of the 1700s, the artists of the 1800s as well. There's a very strong glare. In fact, at this time, There'd be a new interest in glare painting, painting in the midday light. The glare was one of the attractions for John Singer Sargent because it's a new style of painting, to paint into the glare. That's what he would exploit with his watercolor technique. I'm going to move the dome over a bit. One of the things he does is he makes changes in this landscape because in his head he sees Santa Maria della Salute as bigger than it is. But he's going for an effect, and that effect is more important than the scale of this or that or the placement of a particular building, more in keeping with the tradition of Francesco Guardi, with invention. Now with this linear perspective system, if that's the sight line, I know I have, and you can see how it spreads out, and the tradition is equal units down in here before it starts to turn. And when it starts to turn, you move your vanishing point this way. And when it starts to turn again, you move your vanishing point that way. And you just keep sliding your vanishing point along the same sight line as you work your frame. Now I've got that in, and it's very cursory. Just a few suggestions. He does it for years with his watercolors. Eventually, we don't see the pencil lines at all. He's given it up. But he's too young to have that kind of confidence in 1880. That comes later. So we have the burnt sienna, we have the ultramarine blue synthetic, the white, the vermilion, that new chrome yellow, which is this bright yellow you see here, that was favored by artists like Turner. And then this is a chevening blue light. So one of those traditions to get a beautiful gray, a soft gray, would again be the same thing that the Vedusti of centuries before had done. That same burnt sienna is still underneath things. Not underneath everything necessarily, but it helps unify some of the light. And then we go to blues. And the blues we have are different than artists in the preceding century had. The blues we're going to have, apart from the synthetic blue, which was new to this century, cobalt blue new to this century, and by the time Sargent was here, there was even alizarin crimson. But at the L'École des Beaux-Arts, they were still teaching with carmine. There's still no cadmium red. You have to wait until the 20th century for cadmium red. And his friends, like Monet, preferred the vermilion. So we'll use the vermilion that he would have used. The white will be different. He had a white that tended to yellow a little more, lead white out of lead oxide. We have titanium white, which doesn't yellow. Now when the graphite, and he had the underdrawing of the graphite, mixes, you can see it goes a bit gray. And it already helps you develop a sense of atmosphere, just the graphite and the brown. Now the Barbizon painters and tonalist painters would use some black, but by the time we're to the Impressionists of Monet, they've removed black from the palette because they knew, as even Delacroix had said earlier in the century, in the 1850s and 60s, black soils your colors. Stay away from it, mix your darks. And Sargent, as a young man, a hip artist, was going to be mixing them like that. Into some linseed oil, a fast-drying oil, the painting that he does from a balcony here, he calls Venise par temps gris, Venice in gray weather. The gray weather was probably because of all of the steam engines and the smokestacks and the coal that was burning to power the gas lamps here in Venice. My finger in some turp right now. Impressionism depends upon seeing in. That is, looking into the picture and being able to make guesses. Provide the details with your imagination. It's how you actually see. You look for something and you guess, not by knowing it, but by guessing that's what it must be, and you just let it go. And this kind of painting that Sargent was introduced to, and he's practicing right here, is about this kind of ambiguous painting, this kind of looking in. Turner had set the stage when he had called it painting with doubt. Sargent's whole family had been involved in painting. His sister Emily, who would champion his career, was somebody who would not only wave the flag for him throughout his career, but was a fine artist herself. He and his sister, Emily, neither of them would ever marry. Now, Sargent's career was going in the direction of portraiture, but he always loved landscapes. He eventually would stop painting portraits altogether by the time we get to the 20th century, and the last 20 years of his life, he's going to paint landscapes. And he paints many of those landscapes here in Venice, in watercolor and oil. Now I'm going to lay in this atmosphere with a sense of tonalism. That is, it's fairly monochromatic. It's all about this atmosphere, it's all about this feeling of the space, it's all about the quality of the light. I'm going to switch brushes now to something lighter. And try mixing in some of the blues. Now I can gray those blues a little bit, and I can make them a little pinker. Take the synthetic ultramarine blue, or take the new, this is a chevening blue light, but this blue is the blue-green. You see, this is a greener blue than this, and the cerulean blues, which were new, were greener blue. There were new choices in blues. If I mix a little pink with it, red with it, to make something a little more violet, it grays it down. This violet will be a color that he'll really love later. But right now, this is a little too violet for somebody like Sargent in 1880. It's the color he'll migrate to over his life. So by the time he's painting his last paintings in Venice, over the next 35, 40 years, violet is going to be key. He's going to be looking for violets in the shadows and its reflections. But let's take it back to 1880 now and push it back towards something a little more gray. knowing that Sargent's going to change right here in Venice. I can put that down and scrub it up and put it down and scrub it up. In the 1830s, we had new violets, all colors that had not been available to artists of previous time. Access to these colors. It helps get impressionist and tonalist paintings with color rolling. And the colors come in lead tubes. He doesn't carry around little pig bladders, which artists like the Hudson River painters or Turner had to carry around if you're working with oil, and you had to pierce that pig bladder with a pin. While Sargent is painting here like we're doing, he's hearing the same kinds of noises we are. By 1881, a French company had already had the contract on steamships for all the vaporetti here. And the steamships and their horns and all of the noise would all be here with them. Because of the steamships, the air was much cloudier than we see now. It would have had a denser fog, a denser feeling of atmosphere from all of that burning coal. As a port, there were always many languages spoken here. As a tourist mecca, which it was in the 19th century in 1880 when he was here, and as it is today, we hear more and more of the world's languages, the world's visitors coming here for inspiration. Now I have my own sense of glare from this time of day as I look across the sea here, the bay, and I'm going to bring some of that into this painting. Capture some of the glare and the brightness of the water. One of the advantages of squinting is it helps you see values, and when you're staring directly into the sunlight, as we are now with all the glare, we're having to squint. I'm not alone squinting, and the camera crew, director, everybody's experiencing the squint. One of the things that you gain from the squint is the simplification of tone and the elimination of detail. Other Americans who are coming with the same ideas as John Singer Sargent. Although I don't know if we can really call him American, having lived most of his life in Europe. Paris, England, London with his Tite Street studio, still a famous place for studios for artists. But the other Americans, John Henry Twachtman, William Merritt Chase, J. Alden Weir, all blossoming into Impressionists. And they're all arriving here at the same time as John Singer Sargent. They don't quite have his connections, his friendship with Monet, his acquaintance with Manet. There's only one other artist who is that intimately involved with the Impressionist community, more intimately involved than Sargent, and that's Mary Cassatt. Marek Cassatt's the only American to show with the Impressionists in the 1877 Third Impressionist exhibition. Because he's studied the new theories of color and light, he's completely aware of Chevreul's principles of harmony, color, and contrast. He's aware of simultaneous contrast, successive contrast. When I put a red next to a green, it modifies the color. He's aware of all different ways of making color harmonies with really pure color or color tints. Now, a tint for Sargent was just like the Impressionists, that is a pure color with white added. And that's what we have here, working with a lot of tints. And loose scumbling. One of the qualities that would distinguish American Impressionists from the French, and he's just on the edge of becoming an Impressionist. He's still a tonalist, still sort of Barbizon in the Corot camp, not the Monet camp yet. Although he will say of Monet, when I saw the work, it bowled me over. And they become close friends in Giverny, in Monet's garden country estate. But that's still ahead of him. So the American Impression, the thing that distinguishes them is their reverence for drawing. He, of course, had that drilled into him at l'École des Beaux-Arts after years of drawing with plaster casts. So he's going to put some edges in that are more discreet than an experimental impressionist like Renoir, like Monet, or even like Whistler, who was a number of years older than he was, almost a generation. Because those artists were really looking for an effect, that training of putting the line and the edges and the contour drawing and keeping it there so that we have mental anchorage, keeps American Impressionists from really breaking the line and becoming completely immersed in the new idea. I'm going to put some darker darks here, and then they'll taper back to something that's not quite as intense. And I'll test the dark to see how dark it is. We have now Vaporetti stops where Sargent had
Gondolas.
sailboats, fishing boats. But the touch, as the Italian Impressionists, called the Macchiaioli would call it, the tocca, would need to be light. and B, just hinting and suggesting. He puts in final lines of definition, salience, later. I'm going to need to come sideways to check on that line. You can see the value of Impressionism. You don't need to tell people what it is. You set up a stage with the correct perspective, and they will be able to guess what it is. We do this in music, when we don't hear the ends of words, the final consonants, whether or not you're listening to the Rolling Stones, or Kanye West, or Tony Bennett. To get a bridge over a canal, the suggestion of a bridge over a canal. Sargent's touches were deft and quick. He learned that from Carolus Duran. Deft, quick, sure touches. Don't second guess yourself. It's really the zen of painting. You don't hold a brush in your hand. The brush is a part of you, as it is with a great tennis player or golf player. The club or the racket, they are you. But to do that, you had to practice. And as we say in today's terms, 10,000 hours makes an expert. Sargent had the advantage of someone like Mozart. He started very young, and so the skills, the vocabulary, being able to think with a brush in your hand as if it were your own fingers, happens to him early. And that's why we see evidence of it at such a young age, as in the 20s, as he was here. Going to scrub a bit with oil on my finger to find something of that contour line, but keep it vague and atmospheric. The more dissolved the line, the more atmosphere, and the more dissolved the line, the more space. This evocation of space through the dissolution of edges, that slow dissolve, what we call the loss of foveal acuity along edges, was first really discovered and exploited by Leonardo da Vinci. He writes about it in his notebooks. He calls the effect sfumato, the smoky edge. And here is Sargent employing a sfumato technique, a smoky edge technique. This notion that we look into the haze and guess what's there, and we feel more space, more volume, more atmosphere, what Turner in the English would call aerial perspective, atmospheric perspective. That is something that precedes the discovery of perceptual psychology and neuroscience. That comes later. The empiricism comes later, at the end of the 20th century. Then, in 1880, we find an artist like Sargent, intuitively making those discoveries on his own, and of course, previously exposed to not only the writings of Da Vinci, but the paintings of Corot and Da Vinci. The Mona Lisa was in Paris. Now I'm going to carve, just carving, but I don't want to carve with too much clarity, but allow some salience along this edge and variety along that edge. And the variety, the rhythm, the pattern can't be too repetitious, can't be too much of the same again and again. Clunk, 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 clunk. We don't sustain our attention to music like that. Well, not unless we're dancing. And we don't sustain our attention to paintings or literature like that. We want to sustain our attention when the pattern shifts, when we are surprised by change, subtle changes as well as big changes. And John Singer Sargent, in his 20s right here, is learning that lesson and employing it already. This edge isn't the same as this edge. I keep trying to change it, just as he tried to change it. Information theory is based on surprise and how you're able to continually surprise your viewer, your listener, your reader. Those were the lessons that he had been picking up with regard to design and edges and pattern at the L'École des Beaux-Arts and with Carolus Duran. That's what a great artist can teach you. It's not how to render a cow or a tower or even water. It's how to offer a series of wonderful surprises inside of a unified container, whether that is a symphony or whether or not that's a painting. Some of the lessons John Singer Sargent learns from Carolus Duran are the au premier coup, to the first attack, a quick attack, sure-handed, bravura. Duran admired artists like Velázquez and Hals, and the Spanish Caravaggisti like Ribera. He passes on his passion for those artists and their bravura strokes to John Singer Sargent. He also learns how to draw and observe carefully by working from plaster casts at L'École des Beaux-Arts. This helps him develop not only great skills, but gives him confidence to experiment, as he will. The experiments he conducts here in Venice demonstrate great confidence. They are just stream of consciousness painting, talking in the language of paint, a language he spoke eloquently. The other thing Duran has done for him is his own admiration for John's skills allow him to invite John to come work on a ceiling mural with him. It's a commission Duran has. John learns how to work big, and he is interested in murals for the rest of his life. He's offered a commission with both the Boston Library and the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. It's that edge that taught Sargent he could give the illusion of a city, of something rich with detail and activity, without having to paint it all. Then he only needed to interspace a few bits of light that looked reflective, something that might connote the face of the Doge's palace, for example. And here's where he knew truth of tone mattered. It can't be too loud or it loses its place in the harmony. If it's too quiet, you don't see it. So truth in tone was something he got from Carolus Duran, the friend of Corot, who Kenneth Clark said had the best truth in tone of any painter to have lived. And so as any Impressionist would, with very close values keep us in the same atmosphere and the same distance. The reflectance of the water and the reflectance of the pavement here are very close to the same. The water reflects the sky, but it's not as rich in color, so it's a gray, blue here. And the pavement is going to reflect the sunlight and the sky as well. I have to say, as a landscape painter myself, this is a splendid view. This is the kind of place that ought to inspire an aspiring painter like John Singer Sargent, because it certainly inspires one like me. This is the line that an American Impressionist like Sargent would put down. It's not the line that an artist interested in just atmosphere would put down, like a mature Turner, or a mature Whistler, or even later a mature Sargent. But as a young man, he wanted that salience, again, like he wanted this edge. Now I'll scumble it a bit and let it disappear a bit, because as soon as he put it down, he realized it was a little strong and then would start to dissolve it. And I'm doing the same so you have an idea how he was thinking. I need to establish an edge. Oh God, I've established too much of an edge. When any edge is established, it'll always attract our attention. All sharp edges flatten the space. All sharp edges mark abrupt transitions. We human beings are attracted to change. It's the nature of surprise. Just as a startling boat whistle or a bird call, car horn will all attract our attention. Well, it happens visually too. Now, if the note is too startling, it takes us away from the rest of the painting. If it's subtle enough, it simply gives us another area of surprise. It's the basis of information theory. Meaning happens when change occurs. Let me just give you a little more edge for more of that demarcation, because he won't let go of it. He feels the obligation because he feels it establishes the presence of the pavement. The higher the horizon, the more we feel like we're more an elevated point of view to see this image. And the arrangement of clear, interesting shapes, unified shapes, singular shapes, that comes from the Japanese influence. And they couldn't have a lot of disparate shapes, or their image would fall apart, would scatter, wouldn't hold. And so the European artists observed that an interesting design shape had an effective power if you could simplify it.
Sargent advised students to paint past the edges of borders so you could cut in and overlap later. I'm doing that now as I carry the sky down into the silhouette of Venice. His skies were often cloudless, just glowing evidence of light. I am placing this light area, this area of sparkle just below the buildings, the final edge of the water, to draw your attention back into the picture space, to build deeper space as you cross the water and follow the contracting perspective, the perspective of the shrinking esplanade into the distance. Here we look out and across, always searching for the greatest contrast, the light source, infinity.
One of the things that happens here is that not only does the water amplify the light, this big flat reflective surface amplifies the sound as well. So as it was for Sargent, Turner, and Canaletto, but especially from the time of Sargent on to you and me, this vast reflective pool is giving us more ambient sound than at any time in the previous 1,000 years of the Republic's history. You can hear it with me just as Sargent heard it. This design is a sideways V. If I turn the picture this way, it's a standard V. That's a very distilled design. It's how we think. It's one of the most basic principles of design, is to work with that shape. Two of them together and it's the W. Turn it upside down and it's the M. Add another line and it's the N. Turn it sideways, it's the Z. Our letters, globally, Mark Changizi, Vision Revolution, Stanford University, our letters are the foundations of our design systems. And whether or not that is the circle, the half circle, the reverse C, and the V combined, it's as though this is the zigzag without the bottom zig, or the half circle turned into a bit of a V. That design is so fundamental to human perception and the way we organize space. That's part of the success of this design in this century, just as it was a part of the success for Canaletto and for Guardi, using a similar design centuries before. Now, as an artist, he's not so much as the Dutch interested in sparkle, a Dutch word in landscape painting, but because of the reflectance of the water, I see the opportunity for sparkle. More sparkle than the fogged, smoky atmosphere he had when he was painting here. So I'm going to just show you how to bring up a little bit of sparkle because we have that opportunity. Then I'm going to work with some of the people in scale and bring up some of the highlights, like on the top of the Vaporetti stops, where we can have reflected light bouncing just like skittles on a floor. So we add to the cacophony Now, part of the lesson from Japan wasn't just that we could raise this horizon line to create deep space as opposed to the old Dutch method, low, but it was also the simplified singular shape, cleaved for the purpose of acuity and legibility, but unified for the purpose of design. Impressionists would dissolve the Japanese edges, but they would keep the idea of simplified design. And that's what we see with John Singer Sargent here. They also, with this high position, could think about how they liked to see the modeled texture, but how they like to think about the scale of people. We've been looking at people going back in linear perspective for a long time. I'm going to scumble a little bit more on the surface here. It's all right, I'm going to get there. Just to create a little more surface, because he wanted something where it looked like there was a surface below and a surface above. And this scumble gives him that chance, where we see the warm tones poking up through, and this adds to the reflectant value of the pavement. It becomes lighter. And the lighter it becomes, the more it connotes the idea of reflectance to any beholder, viewer like you or me. Now just keep those marks flat. That's why I'm using horizontal strokes. So this modeled horizontally stroked surface inside of a simplified design with reflectance that is equivalent to the reflectance of the water. The flatter and smoother and harder the surface, the more reflectant it will be. And that's going to be a principle that's going to be studied in great depth just a couple of years later by Paul Cézanne. Now a little bit of Dutch sparkle. Sparkle is a definition. You take a dark area, any area that is darker than the other, and concentrate a small area of light within it, you'll get sparkle. If that sparkle area, the lighter area, is bigger and dissolves in its edges and has a complementary color relationship with its surrounding territory, you're going to get a feeling of luminance. So we're going for sparkle right now, and I'm going to use terp to lift out the paint to give me something of that sparkle. The terp, and I can't use much or it will drip across the painting, will help it compete with the light that's above. In this area, if I lift off a little bit, it really sparkles because the dark is darker than it is here. So any area I want a great deal of reflectance, like the top of a Vaporetti stop, that's a great deal of reflectance. And you can see how it just snaps out. I may push it down a little bit if it's a little strong, but I wanted to illustrate how it sparkles just because the surrounding territory is darker. We have a lot of sparkle along this line of boats because here's where all the Vaporetti, these are the main stops. If you're coming to Venice from a tour ship or the airport, your boats pull in right here. It was no different in the time of John Singer Sargent. The boats would be pulling in here. A slight sense of glare. Because you're attracted to the light, your eyes go to these points of light, not just to points of transition, but to points of light. I can even imply the reflectance of Santa Maria della Salute here by lifting out some areas and applying paint to some adjacent areas. The Impressionists who are coming behind the tonalists will do this by adding a tint, adding a color. So rather than lift out, they might put something on, like this. Now the figures are very small down here. And he scales them back as just little indications. In fact, that's kind of what Canaletto does. He's a little more tight with his shapes. Guardi's looser with his shapes. Turner is even much looser and just evokes in the vaguest possible way. And the later Impressionists will do the same. The scale is the most important issue. And from the Japanese, he'd been looking down. He'd seen figures walking over long bridges down below. That's what you noticed in those woodcuts. And there he saw crowd scenes of very small people getting even smaller, congregating in small groups. I'm testing the value before I touch the canvas. And then know that they're very small and they get paler as they go back, just as all of the other elements do. But a person would be that big to get into that Vaporetti stop, very small. The pavement is very big. It was expanded in the 1930s by the fascists here in Venice. At the time that Sargent was here, the pavement was not this large. He's just gesturing and thinking that whatever he gestures, you will be able to guess figure into. It's what we do. You and I, one of the first things we do is see figures. We see faces first when we look into ambiguous territories. It's why when you look at your clothing over a chair late at night as a child in your bedroom, you might see, ooh, do I see a wolf? Do I see a witch? What's happening is it's our ability to project into ambiguity possibilities. The first thing we see are faces. The second thing we see are bodies. And one of the things that artists like Sargent does, or even Da Vinci, is to provide you with an ambiguous territory with marks that are the appropriate scale into which you can guess the possibility of figures. So as the figures come closer to us, they not only get bigger, but their values get more intense. Just as they got one value here, darker, lighter, lighter, and smaller. Which is all I'm doing here, which is all he did. If you look closely, they're nothing but marks. But because the scale is right and the value is right, we have the possibility of projection. You'll notice that not only the figure's bigger, but as they go back, the figures are smaller, more diminutive in size, but the value, the contrast difference, the ratio of difference in the background diminishes. So the difference between light and dark is not as strong there as it is here. So finally, I have somebody with legs. And then the figures mass together. So we have this trail of figures, all indicating a sense of the size of what's here. They also all lead us like ants going to their colony back into this space. Now, as a true impressionist, you might want to blur this out, but I'm looking at an edge that's much more distinct. And so my own poetic interpretation is to let the edge be a little more clear, because the air is clearer, the light is sharper. If I were in Sargent's time with all that smog, not that we don't have smog here in Venice, we do, from the industrial cities that surround it like Mestre, but we don't have all that billowing coal smoke. And it was that billowing coal smoke that gave him more atmosphere. It gave the deadly fogs where people couldn't see in front of themselves in London, and a chance for Frankenstein to be born or the werewolf to be born. Those ideas come out of that dark, foggy mystery. As I evaporate the distance left and right of Santa Maria della Salute with a softer blue, a color that is closer in value to the sky and the water, I let this territory move slowly forward and create more atmospheric perspective to the back. It creates a different kind of depth rather than the line that was just continuous all the way along. Not quite dissolving it completely, but enough to create a push-pull of where some of this architecture is versus some of that. Now, as with people, so with boats. Test a value. And if I have darker values in here, I don't want them to be too dark out here. And I'll make it even paler. Too pale, and of course you see nothing. Some contrast is required. And the next thing you know, we have a flotilla of activity on the water. That flotilla for Venice, while it was a warring empire, was made right over there, just a few hundred yards from where I'm standing now. Thousands of Venetians were employed to make the navies to create and sustain this great empire, which would eventually leave us this view. The empire is gone, but the architecture and the view are still here. Now I'll pull up the contrast in the front, just a little bit more. And as the contrast jumps as I come forward, with higher degrees of color variation and value difference, it brings this part of the picture farther forward and lets that part of the picture recede. And now it's not scale, it's relative contrast that's doing the job. You can subtract light and you can add it with an opaque white. Now that we have titanium white, or just a very bright tint, as the Impressionists did, they would also try to opaquely add the light. One of the things they lose when they add the light, though, is that feeling of luminance that comes from beneath the paintings. So if you were to stack up a William Merritt Chase against a Turner, you'll probably notice that the Turner wins in luminance. That's what's happened to me when I've tried. However, I want to show you how they thought by applying some of that color here, just so that you can see how it works and make the decisions yourself. I'm going to come in here with a cleaner white. Because this has a little bit of red in it, I'll put a little bit of yellow, and it's just a little gray that way. I'm going to put a little yellow in it. To green up the white. And show you what happens when we add opaque paint back in here. you get a different kind of glare. The Impressionist idea of adding light. I'm using my little finger as a maul stick. There's no oil at all really now, it's just paint. Pushing the contrast to increase the feeling of glare. It can be done here too. And now we're at a difference between the first half of the 19th century with Turner and Hudson River painters and others lifting the light, and these Impressionists, and Barbizon painters too, but mostly these Impressionists adding their lights with opaque touches. As I stand here painting, through the eyes of Sargent, through the eyes of a hopeful, ambitious, and prodigious talent, I'm reminded of other artists, other times, of the views of New York's harbor when Stieglitz sets up his camera and finds the same mystery that Sargent finds here. The more the values shift in degree going back, the deeper that space can become as we go down the Grand Canal. In those pictures that were photographed or that were painted later by the Ashcan School in New York, they had to have seen this work of Sargent, the work of the Impressionists, the work of the atmospherics and the simple design, and know that it was the new path for them as well. You'll notice how I've grouped the figure. It's kind of a small triangle pointing down, but they all snake their way back in a path leading you somewhere into some situation. Sargent, in his own painting, will put a little vendor here with the awning ripping and flapping, because it was just a device, as I've put this figure here, in this little group of figures, to keep you realizing that this is a pavement that's flat, otherwise it just turns into an abstract territory. Not that there's anything wrong with that. That's exactly what's going to happen with artists like Richard Diebenkorn in the 1960s with his Ocean Park series, is to finally say, guess what? This texture, these colors, this design needs nothing. No people, no boats. It just needs the luminance and the coherence of a simplified design. It has to have no reference to narrative material. Sargent is right on one of the pivot points of history, moving from the information into just a visual experience. The encounter I'm having here with John Singer Sargent, painting right beside me, is revelatory. Sargent, like me, works in those rectangular formats. It's what we do. It's how we see. It's the shape of a book. Whether or not that book is a Kindle or an iPad, it's the shape we recognize to look into and to cull information, to find an image, to find space. So if I can clean up the edges, I'll have a better book, a better window. It's easier to do if I take off these protective rubber gloves. I wear these because Sargent wasn't aware that he was handling carcinogenic material, which with the cadmium paints, the cobalt paint, he was. Art changes, tastes change, fashions change. We have witnessed many of those changes in art since John Singer Sargent painted on a balcony here in Venice. But something John Singer Sargent still delivers is the experience and the delight of looking, the sensual pleasure of responding to the light, the atmosphere, the sense of place, the cacophony of noise, the wind, the breeze, the birds, and the sunlight on the water reflecting on the buildings. All of that together creates and defines Venice, but it creates and defines John Singer Sargent. The thing that matters with John Singer Sargent is in the paint. It's not just his deft touches, it's not just his economy of expression, it's not just his glorious color, it's the sum of all that. So that in a personal encounter with a watercolor or an oil, you and I can be transformed. We can discover what it's like to look for the first time and begin to see all over again, because John Singer Sargent has shown us the color and beauty of the world in a singular way on a two-dimensional surface with either oil or watercolor. I'm David Dunlop. I'm a landscape painter.